Hello everyone, I'm Rio. Today we're going to talk about illegal immigration. A long time ago, I made a video discussing what it means to be undocumented in the United States. In fact, it somewhat defines what illegal immigration is to a certain extent. Of course, illegal immigration is a highly controversial topic involving immigration law, humanitarian issues, as well as economic, labor, and national security aspects. So, to discuss illegal immigration, we first need to define what illegal immigration is. Let's take a look at a description from the official website of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. According to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's website, the term for illegal immigrants in English is unauthorized immigrants, which can be translated as undocumented immigrants or unauthorized immigrants. The specific description is as follows: most unauthorized residents either entered the United States without inspection, or were admitted temporarily staying past the date they were required to leave. So what does this mean? Literally translated, it means that most unauthorized residents either entered the U.S. without inspection or were temporarily admitted but stayed beyond the date they were required to leave. Simply put, it means either entering illegally or entering legally but overstaying, which results in losing legal status and becoming an illegal resident. As for illegal entry, naturally, there is no legal status from the start. Of course, from a humanitarian perspective, there are some pathways to remove the unauthorized status and become authorized. However, please note that legal status, also known as legal residency, is different from authorized stay or authorized residence, as well as a legal stay within the U.S. immigration law system. We can understand authorized residence or authorized stay as legal residents, including green card holders, non-immigrant status residents, and residents with authorized residence. So, illegal immigrants or illegal residents are basically equivalent to those who do not have a green card, non-immigrant status, or authorized residence as foreigners. These concepts are actually quite complex, so I will provide a detailed explanation for everyone when I have the opportunity. In short, the way one enters the United States and their status in the U.S. are the only two key factors that determine whether a foreigner is an illegal immigrant. And the status in the U.S. is the core element in determining whether someone is an illegal immigrant. According to the current immigration law system, this is how it is set up. Therefore, it's not hard to imagine that even if someone enters the U.S. illegally, they can become a legal immigrant through humanitarian procedures, or more accurately, become an authorized resident. However, a foreigner who enters the U.S. legally with a non-immigrant visa, such as by plane, can also become an illegal immigrant if they let their legal status lapse. In reality, losing legal status doesn't only occur through overstaying. For example, if someone enters the U.S. on a tourist visa and starts working, from an immigration law perspective, their status is immediately lost. However, in most cases, it's difficult to detect. In other words, they give you a 6-month stay period, but if you start working as soon as you enter the U.S., it means that your status is actually lost as soon as you enter the U.S., not after the 6 months are out. However, as mentioned earlier, this is actually very difficult to detect, and this is the current situation in the U.S. So, if a foreigner illegally enters the U.S. and doesn't engage in any so-called cleaning up operations, then the U.S. border enforcement agencies wouldn't even know about your existence. This is what truly constitutes an illegal immigrant in the strictest sense. If you take the initiative to report to the immigration office or go through certain procedures at the U.S.-Mexico border, of course, this process, now called CBP, 1 might have some changes in between. Then, if you come in through this process, customs will ask you what your name is, where you live, and so on. Why are you coming to the United States? You are very likely to be temporarily authorized to stay in the U.S. according to the procedure, and at the very least, sending you back home will take time. So, from a broader perspective, among the group of illegal immigrants, especially those entering the U.S. illegally, not everyone is intentionally breaking the law. Many people are likely forced to choose illegal entry into the United States due to economic pressures, humanitarian reasons, or even threats to their lives. I can share a personal experience here. It was over a decade ago when I attended an immigration court hearing, and the judge at the time asked the person involved if they were willing to accept a postponement of the trial. The reason was that over 20,000 children had walked into the United States from Mexico, and all the asylum officers, the U.S. immigration officials responsible for the asylum process, had to rush to the U.S.-Mexico border to identify the children entering and follow the subsequent procedures. This was actually part of the large-scale Central American minor immigration wave that the United States experienced around 2014. These minors mainly came from the Northern Triangle countries, namely Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Of course, there were also a small number of minors from Mexico who entered the United States illegally, especially the UAC, which stands for Unaccompanied Alien Children, cannot be immediately deported. Around 2014, approximately over 70,000 unaccompanied minors crossed the U.S.-Mexico border to seek asylum in the United States. The reason why so many children from these countries enter the United States is largely due to local gang violence. Criminal activities and related factors are closely linked to this. In their communities, they are 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 in their communities. Criminal activities and related factors are closely linked. In their communities, these gangs recruit children to sell drugs. If the children refuse to join the gangs and their families cannot pay protection fees, they are very likely to be killed. This, in fact, is the first time in all my years in the United States that I have directly and vividly felt the impact of a humanitarian crisis. At that time, the person attending the immigration interview was a woman from mainland China whom we called Big Sister. When she heard that the interview was postponed, and for 3 years, she felt as if she had been set up and was so agitated that she took out her heart medication on the spot. This kind of scene is truly unforgettable. According to statistics from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, there are over 10 million undocumented immigrants in the United States from 4 major regions. Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Ecuador, and even Brazil have undocumented entering the United States. The undocumented immigrants from these countries and regions are mostly driven by economic hardships, social violence, and other factors to enter the United States. Among Asian countries, well, China, right, and India are the main sources of undocumented immigrants. Typically, undocumented immigrants from Asian countries enter legally and then overstay their visas. In the past 2 years, the number of people from Asia entering the United States through the border has increased significantly, especially Indians. Where do these Indians come from? They enter the United States through the US-Canada border. Of course, today I'm not discussing the situation of Indians in Canada. Finally, undocumented immigrants also come from Africa, such as Haiti and Nigeria, driven by factors like national unrest and poverty, prompting people to take risks to enter the United States. Therefore, many people believe that undocumented immigrants might not be what they understand as undocumented immigrants in the true sense. Of course, you could also say, hey, even if they regularize their status through humanitarian procedures, I still consider them undocumented immigrants. Yes, that's your own understanding or opinion, and that's perfectly fine. Alright, now that we've clarified what constitutes an undocumented immigrant, let's take a look at what impact undocumented immigrants have on American society. In my view, the impact is multifaceted. It's too complex to simply say we should just deport all undocumented immigrants, right? The most direct impact we can see is in the economic aspect, where you could say that the benefits and drawbacks coexist. Undocumented immigrants engage in a lot of labor-intensive jobs, such as in livestock, agriculture, construction, and manufacturing, right? And also some parts of the service industry, similar to how people from rural areas or economically underdeveloped regions in China move to big cities for work. These laborers fill many jobs that Americans are unwilling to do, and they actually contribute to economic development. At the same time, the use of public funds and resources by undocumented immigrants cannot be ignored. For example, in terms of medical resources and education, under the current U.S. social system, undocumented immigrants can basically access resources almost equivalent to those of authorized residents. The impact of this is quite complex, but it may be related to the fact that undocumented immigrants do not contribute to tax revenue. Similarly, we can compare this to people moving from small towns to big cities to live and work, with their children attending local schools and needing to access medical resources at local top-tier hospitals or better ones, right? Actually, there is a great similarity here. So, it's quite obvious that unauthorized work is often accompanied by cash transactions, leading ordinary citizens and legal immigrants to believe that undocumented immigrants are just earning money locally without paying taxes, not contributing to society, and yet enjoying local resources. This is the most direct perception people have. Of course, undocumented immigrants are often considered the main source of impact on the local job market. However, if you meet the definition of undocumented immigrants, in reality, when you think about it carefully, it's almost impossible for them to affect legal residence. Because if someone has completely entered the U.S. illegally without any of the so-called legalization processes I mentioned earlier, it is also very difficult for them to find jobs that legal residents can engage in. Secondly, in terms of social impact, immigrants themselves contribute to racial diversity and cultural diversity, which is quite evident. Illegal immigrants are actually a part of this as well. However, disorderly and non-compliant entry into the U.S. has a significant negative impact on the stability of American society. This is especially true as illegal immigration leads to a sharp increase in crime rates in certain communities, which is undeniable. Moreover, there are organized gangs and large groups of people entering the U.S. to engage in drug trafficking, human smuggling, money laundering, and other criminal activities. Among them, there are criminal groups from Central and South America and the Caribbean, such as those from Mexico. What is the name of this criminal group? Let me take a look. This criminal group. For example, the Mexican criminal group is called the Sinaloa Cartel and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. You see, they even call it the new generation, which indicates that this is not the first wave. These cartel groups are very rampant in their activities in the United States. Compared to Mexico, the Venezuelan gangs have a much smaller scale of activity in the United States, definitely not as extensive as those from Mexico. In recent years, a growth trend has emerged, with newcomers rising amid immigration waves, as gang members join illegal entrance into the U.S. Asian illegal immigrants often bring crime, unlike those from Central and South America. For instance, human trafficking, as mentioned, can be self-initiated. I mentioned before that sometimes it's actually self-transportation, where individuals transport themselves. This includes forced labor, illegal gambling, money laundering, and other activities. Some African crime groups, for example from Nigeria, come to the United States to engage in criminal activities, primarily financial fraud. This includes online work, including online scams and credit card fraud, all involving unauthorized transactions. As for illegal immigrants from the Middle East, I don't need to elaborate. It's related to terrorism, which is a lingering shadow in the minds of the American public. Politically, the issue of illegal immigration in the United States is quite evident and extremely complex, arguably more so than in any other country in the world. Of course, Europe is also gradually facing these issues. The issue of illegal immigration in Europe is different from that in the United States. In other words, the U.S. has to deal with a humanitarian crisis while also strengthening border control. It's like a patient who has both anemia and high blood sugar. On one hand, you need rest, and on the other, you need exercise, right? In the U.S., the two political parties have distinctly different attitudes towards illegal immigration. Illegal immigration, or to put it more broadly, immigration, right? This issue has always been a focal point in American political contests, especially Trump, right? I have previously talked about Trump, about his immigration policies, and how we should view them, including what adjustments and changes might occur in the direction of immigration over the next 4 years. This will lead to the already complex immigration issue becoming even more multidimensional, with the difficulty and complexity increasing exponentially. Of course, my personal view is that immigration issues should not be politicized, but what I say doesn't really count. So, in dealing with illegal immigration, the United States has actually taken a series of measures, such as strengthening border patrols, deploying drones, and building separation walls. At the same time, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or CBP, locates and tracks illegal immigrants within the United States and quickly deports them. However, compared to the large number of illegal immigrants, it seems completely disproportionate. The reasoning is actually quite simple. This is not solely an issue for the United States, right? To use an inappropriate analogy, just because you follow traffic rules while driving doesn't mean others won't crash into you. This is a concept that everyone who understands. Therefore, in my view, the issue of illegal immigration involves far too many factors. It is a very complex problem that cannot be solved overnight. It requires us to uphold the law while maintaining humanitarian concern and to protect American national interests while also listening to the voices of those who cross borders for survival. So, what is your attitude towards illegal immigration? I'm Leo. See you next time.